Hit the record. Got it. Okay. Well, I'm really delighted today to be joined by Garth Japhet on Zoom from South Africa. I'm Melanie Katzman talking to you from my office here in New York City. Garth is a medical doctor who's more interested in health than disease. He's devoted his career to promoting and supporting the health of both people and communities. Garth co-founded Seoul City, one of South Africa's most loved television shows. It's watched by over 50 million people, probably even more by the time we're talking. It's a soap opera set in a fictional Seoul City township where he exposes the challenges and offers guidance on difficult issues such as domestic violence and war. Garth is also the author of a newly released book called Like Water Is for Fish, which underscores the importance of stories in our lives. So thank you, Garth, for agreeing to speak with me today. When I asked you how to introduce you, you didn't actually tell me all those things. What you first said to me was I could introduce you as a good friend. And that meant the world to me. Because I met you in 2004 in South Africa, and you described why you started Seoul City. And I realized you've done so much more since then, but I had to start with Seoul City because that's the way I met you. And you told me that as a doctor, you could not heal one person at a time with the speed with which you wanted to have an impact. That really sat with me because as a psychologist, I felt that I can't actually have as much of an impact as I want if it's one person at a time. Those deep and meaningful conversations are critical, but on the other hand, I really wanted to cascade my knowledge and do whatever I could for individuals and groups in society. And so I look to you as a person who at a pivotal moment in my professional life challenged me by your work to do more with mine. So I really can't tell you how much I appreciate the chance to talk with you today.
Sure, that's amazing, Melanie. Thank you so much. Yeah, and having read your book, and I want to be reading others of your books, it really is fantastic just to connect like this again.
Oh, great. So here's what I thought we would do. Like, I wanted to actually start in the middle and then we'll go backwards and forwards. So if I just start with Seoul City, because what's a doctor doing creating a soap opera? Like that just is not a normal path. And so let's start there and then we'll kind of go backwards and talk about how you became a doctor and how you came to write the book.
Well, I suppose, to start off with the fact that I'm not a normal doctor. So that's probably the first place to begin.
Okay, well, as a psychologist, let me be the judge of that.
Yeah. So like maybe you can charge me for time on the couch. But I think the key thing was that the reasons I did medicine were always motivated more by my desire to make a difference to the people of my country, my continent, and I saw medicine as a way of doing that. However, the reality of medicine was very different, particularly in the context that I wanted to work. So I never sort of envisaged a great private practice and whatever. That was never my vision.
Can I just jump in there and say, because you're talking to us from South Africa, not everybody is actually familiar with what you may have been seeing as you were growing up. So just paint me a quick picture and then we'll talk about how you saw medicine.
So I grew up in South Africa during the apartheid years. Obviously, the pariah of the world, legislated racial discrimination, separation of peoples. I went to a school, all-white university. So we're talking, 70s, 80s. And I was fortunate enough to, have a father who was quite socially aware and active. And that gave me a real understanding. Because, you live in a society, you actually don't, unless it's pointed out to you, it's just what you're used to. So when people, look at us, South Africa and apartheid and say, how did people not know? If you're born into it, it's sometimes not. So that was the context. And the vast majority of Black people were living in these so-called townships or ghettos, separated from white people, and their health outcomes were very, very different, and still unfortunately are. So, for instance, one of the richest sort of parts of South Africa is in Johannesburg, and probably sort of 3 or 4 miles away from the epicenter of financial richness was the township that I worked in, this ghetto, which had 1 million people in 5 square kilometers. And there, the number one cause of child death was diarrhea.
Mm.
And so I was working as a doctor in that context and seeing kids coming in either dead or dying, literally on a daily basis. And something like that is preventable. Not yes, you can treat, but it's so preventable.
Mm.
And that's what sort of began me, that and other experiences, on this path of saying clinical medicine is wonderful, but it actually strangely has not made a huge difference to health outcomes.
Mm.
Historically, the big changes on health outcomes globally have been safe water, sanitation, better food, better education. And so, the billions of dollars we put into high-tech healthcare really only make a tiny difference.
Yeah.
So that's really what got me sort of thinking, I've got to do something different.
I've got to do something different. I have to educate people. But then you weren't actually going out and giving talks and saying, okay, here's how you can improve your sanitation, or here's how you can prevent diarrhea. You did something very different. You
Yeah, so
created a
I
soap
suppose
opera.
intuitively I sort of understood that. I suppose I've always been impacted by story. I mean, the reason I did medicine was impacted by a series of books I read when I was 13. So I suppose intuitively I understood that if we were going to really get to people, it would need to be through engaging people's knowledge through story. And I actually began by writing for a newspaper. I had a weekly column, and I used characters and stories to illustrate points. And it was based on the success of that I had this idea, this crazy idea, to do not just soap opera, but actually radio in 9 languages and supplementary print all in one go, and make it an ongoing thing. Yeah.
Wait a second. So this was like, you didn't just dream little, you dreamed big. You went, because oftentimes people talk about proof of concept, like we should come up with a small idea. You went, no, multiple languages, multiple platforms.
Yes. Yeah. Is that who knows why? I think I was
Can you
probably
take a
too
second
dumb.
and think about that? Because that's a pretty
Well,
bold.
yes, it was bold, but I think sometimes you part of it, and again, having looked at my book, part of it was around almost proving myself. I wanted to actually achieve something extraordinary, and so the motivation was probably about partially, not partially, a lot of it was probably selfish, was around saying, hey, let me, if by any chance this actually could really happen, that would be a confirmation of who I am. So I think
What I think that that's really important point, though. People often talk about having a dream or an audacious dream as being selfish or narcissistic, and I think if you don't have a dream, you can't make dreams come true, and that somehow we put a negative cast on ambition and boldness in that context, and people kind of cower in the face of that. Whereas, in fact, you wouldn't have been able to go big had you not been audacious. And so it was driven by, the pearl was made from a bit of sand, but I guess I would say, so what?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, as it turned out, thank God it turned out okay. So, but I think the other thing was, I suppose it's a character thing, is that I, probably why would never have been a very good clinical doctor, is that I'm not great with detail. And so something small and sort of confined and very well done, I was happy with a degree of grayness, and being able to have a vision that broadly speaking was compelling, and I knew broadly what I wanted to do, but it was very much this concept of one cat's eye on the road, one piece of a big vision, and then eating it. From the time I had the idea to the time of fruition was a good 3-4 years. So there were lots of little steps in between, but.
And then, because people listening to this conversation may not know what Soul City ultimately became, can you just tell a little bit about kind of what happened?
So it became, as I say, multiple platforms. The difference between, using drama, primetime television, still in the days in which the public broadcaster, reached the majority of people, prior to cable, prior to internet. And so it was a primetime TV series. Not so much a soap opera as a drama, sort of ongoing characters set in the clinics, funny enough, that I'd been working in. We
Mm.
just gave it a fictional name. And the idea was to create an ongoing vehicle to deal with different health issues. And over time, it became one of the 3 most watched programs in the region. Sort of 1 in 3 adults were watching it on a regular basis. It was supplemented by characters taken out of these really popular characters that people grew to know and love. They were then used them into illustrated comics, using the same characters, and over, I think, 45 million copies of these comics were distributed. And then same issues, different characters through radio, also
Mm.
drama, also story, but with a much more rural base. The storylines were much more rural.
Mm.
But the difference was that we, probably with colleagues, because none of this stuff happens by
Of
yourself,
course.
was that bringing quite a scientific method to how to do this, as opposed to just getting a bunch of script writers and, raising money and going on television.
I mean, really, in so many ways, so ahead in terms of using education to educate. And just to kind of make it real, maybe we can use domestic violence as an example. Unfortunately, an ongoing issue. Could you just talk a little bit about, like, I remember seeing one of the shows where the women were banging pots and pans and bringing attention to the fact that they were being abused. And then you had, and I'm probably summarizing poorly, and then you had the helpline information, and just the amount of engagement and reporting shifted enormously. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as you say, unfortunately, still a huge problem globally. But yeah, it was really one of our most landmark sort of interventions and huge impact. Is that, first of all, the stories themselves were deeply embedded in a research process. So we understood, when we look at drama and change, drama is always about overcoming obstacles.
Yes.
The best drama is taking characters on a journey and overcoming obstacles. And the research process showed us where the key obstacles were, to women seeking help, to men changing behavior, etc. And we built that into this very compelling drama series. And we were able to role model through the lives of these characters various ways of dealing with these obstacles, be it getting the community involved. I mean, one of the huge issues people have with domestic violence is, if I intervene, I'm going to get hurt myself.
Right.
And our research process unpacked this, found this example from South America, where this concept of banging pots outside the house, and we, incorporated that into this drama. And amazingly, within months, we had reports from across the country of people using this mechanism.
Right.
And then, combined with that, there was new legislation around protection orders for women to get protection orders. People weren't aware of it; they didn't know how to use it. So we were able to show the protection orders being used, and we was, in parallel, we did training with police. We created the helpline. We created these booklets around the resources. So it's story as catalyst, and then it's these multiple layers to support it.
So there's something incredible. There's so many things that are incredible about what you're describing, because it's the integration of drama and storytelling, and then good science, and also good partnership. Like, how will you? I spend so much time talking to people about multi-stakeholder engagement and being able to actually bring the different skill sets to try to solve a problem. Here we are again with yet more, continuing global crisis. We are struggling with a pandemic. There's an effort afoot to try to get people to listen and to engage and to feel socially responsible. And yet it's so many challenges. What advice do you have, or what observations can you share about, like, what you've learned about how you bring so many different experiences to bear, such that you can bring the expertise out from different contributors?
Well, I think probably 2 things. One is obviously to, that classic thing of a win-win is understand, for instance, our scriptwriters or, people, to actually know that their motivation in life is to create great story, great art, and to allow them to do that while at the same time allowing us to to create a social dividend. So this concept of making sure that you understand where value lies for the other party. So the way for instance, we were able to bring corporates on board. British Petroleum, for instance, was a sponsor for many years. The way we managed to do that was understanding that they're a commercial company. They need to build brand, and that connecting their brand to ours could be good.
Right.
And so, yeah, looking for benefit and understanding what benefit might look like for the other person. I think the other group, the other thing is possibly taking ego out of it.
Ooh, how do you do that? Do you have a pill for that? Like, how do you take ego out of it?
Well, I think one of the advantages I have is I'm actually quite lazy. So the not wanting to necessarily hog the limelight is mainly because I'm too lazy to hog the limelight. But it does actually allow people to feel ownership when it's not feeling actually that they get recognition for the work that they've done. So I think recognition, win-win, and I like the phrase lead from behind.
Yes.
And allow others to, and I think that is key to building these partnerships.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when I've worked with other leaders who have really had these very successful collaborations, there's having enough ego or guts to have the bold idea, and then also having enough confidence or laziness to pull back and let others really feel that ownership. And I think that's a very unique combination, in fact, Garth. I mean, as self-effacing as you might want to be, I think that boldness, but then also the ability to kind of lean into the solution and then lean out when other people are filling the space is it really an important flexibility that is not always so easily found.
Yeah. And I think, maybe it's not a conscious thing. It's just the way that I operate in the world is, and I think it's also the way you build a great organization often.
And that's one of the things I'd be really interested in. I mean, because I kind of asked you to start where I met you, but you've built multiple organizations. So like you went on and you built Heartlines. So tell me just a little bit about Heartlines.
Well, I suppose, I got to the point in Seoul City where it became big and wonderful, and lots of great people who were, smart and doing amazing stuff and had a great pipeline of funding. And I'm probably a better entrepreneur than I am bureaucrat. And it got to a point where it became quite systematic, bureaucratic. And I suppose I was looking for the next thing. And intuitively, although the health issues are so critical, my heart was really around human behavior and around, saying what would happen if we all lived our better selves? How do we'd impact not just on domestic violence, we'd also impact on a range of other things. So the core issues that underpin so much of these negative things in our society come down to how we show up every day.
Yes.
And so the challenge for me was so many people in our society claim to aspire after a great set of values, and yet there's this big gap between what we believe and what we do. And the question is, what happened if we did live our better selves? And that was the initiative for Heartlines, to take what I knew around storytelling, around multiple layers, around all of those things, to inspire and support people to live their values, but related to issues that weren't just health related. So, the issue of division, breakdown, social cohesion, discrimination, all of those things, which are not health related, were things that were close to my heart.
And so how does one do that? I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to people about how do you want to show up, right? And really asking people to align their behavior with their stated values, and then to take that alignment and bring it into their office, and then take their office behavior and bring it into their community, right? So I'm always thinking about those multiple spheres, like who am I? Who am I in my family, in my workplace, my community, and in the larger world? So tell me more, like how do we help people get that alignment?
Well, I don't think it's any one person or any one strategy. I think, you would know much more than I would, but we're very complex beings. And to think that a program or a intervention is going to fundamentally shift people is wrong. but you find people on different places in a journey. And you never know whether your intervention is the beginning of a journey or is actually the tipping point that comes at the end. And that's part of the part of the challenge of the work we do is, it's like planting a tree under which the shade you may never sit, is that um, is that so ultimately we, through storytelling, through the interventions we do, aim to find people at different places on that journey. So if we quite like the theory of change that Malcolm Gladwell made famous through the tipping point,
Right.
which you've got the igniters, the early adopters, and so you've got people at a point who are very receptive to being challenged and who would grasp the opportunity to think differently about their lives, and it might just take them over the edge, and they in turn become the catalyst for those around them. And so rather than change the entire world, we aim to really inspire and find those people who are at that point. So I don't know, I gave you a sort of roundabout
That's really
answer,
interesting. So if I kind of nerd out for a second on psychological theory, that if you look at kind of psychological theory of change, you have people who are what we call pre-contemplators. They haven't even thought about the possibility of change.
Yes,
then you have people
yes,
who are in contemplation and they're thinking about it. And then you have people that you want to move those people who are thinking into action, who are different than people who are maintainers. And at any given point and at any given issue, you can move up and down along that spectrum.
Yes. And there's one more step. There's one more step is where those who are active actually become inspirers of others.
Inspire, exactly.
Yeah. So they become advocates for that behavior.
But I think this, to the point that you're making, which is such an important one, you have to know where people are at. So if I talk to someone who is at the point of being flipped into being an inspirational change agent, that's a different conversation than someone who's in a pre-contemplation, right? So we need to meet people where they're at and understand the kind of conversation to have with them.
Yeah, I think for the type of work we do is that is important, but also because of the use of film and TV drama, etc., we often don't know where people are,
Interesting, right?
And simply, just you name the film that's inspired you recently, that film or TV series, for some person may take them to the point of contemplation. From pre-contemplation. For another person, the same narrative will take them to the next step. So particularly in the use of story and drama, it's simply the emotional experience of the being dragged into that world can actually move you, either multiple steps or one step.
So that's what I want to ask you about, which is about moving people through emotion rather than reason. So I am going to ask you to talk to me from both the social entrepreneurship perspective, but also from the medical perspective. Like, what's the neurobiology of emotion and how that impacts the way that we change? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think, and strangely, it's really been something of the last sort of 100 years or so where we've thought that if we give people enough facts that we can shift behavior. But historically and through history, great movements, great changes have come through story, through, look at all the great religions of the world. They're all story based. They're not fact based. And it's just, and I think within the business world, etc., we're beginning to understand if we really want to engage with people, we tell stories. And the reason for that is a neurobiological reason, is that we are wired for story. When I give you facts, I engage a tiny piece of your brain, which unfortunately means that you retain and then you lose quite quickly. When I tell you a story, I mean, literally the neurochemistry, you can see different parts of the brain light up in sympathy with whatever you're engaging with. So for instance, if we talk about running through the grass with the wind in our hair and smelling the summer flowers, the motor part of your brain lights up as you run, as you engage with the character running. The wind in your hair, the sensory parts, the smell, the noises, and that's why we remember and are impacted by story.
And so would you say that it's like our oxytocin, our bonding hormones are activated such that we become much more shared human agents, that we are experiencing the connection because we are hardwired to connect?
Yes, yes. So I mean, that is a particular, thing around oxytocin, which is it's been called the love hormone.
Yes.
Um, but it is the hormone that gets released often when you hear you empathize with a character, with a story. It's the story, as the work of Paul Zak, which is
Yeah.
around experiments to show that people whose oxytocin has been stimulated by a empathetic story are likely to be more giving than those who've not been exposed to that story. So yeah, I mean, there's fascinating neuroscience which simply backs up what I think we've intuitively understood since we crawled out of the cave, which is, if I want to influence you, I tell you a story.
So let's talk about that for a second. So although my training is as a clinical psychologist, I spent a lot of my time in business and organizations working with people who are trying to bring others along. And I certainly am encouraging them not just to present pie charts and Excel sheets, but to tell a story, to bring a narrative. What do you think about the power of storytelling at the organizational level? What have you seen that's kind of worked, and what have been some pitfalls that you would kind of shine a light on?
Well, I think there's, first of all, the sort of reticence from people to, when you say that sort of thing, to say, well, I'm not a storyteller.
Uh-huh.
So I think, first of all, I find that the best way to sort of deal with people is to try and tell a story from your own experience.
Uh-huh.
If it's a personal narrative, even if it's a small thing, and it maybe not even engaged with the broad topic, but the more you can engage whatever the issue is with some form of narrative, and the best form, because we tell it best, is something that is personal, something that is, from my own experience.
Yeah.
So short story. I love the sentence, "Let me tell you a story," because you can see that the change in the room,
Yeah.
is people will be sort of nodding off, and then you say, "Let me tell you a story,"
And they put
and
their phone down for a minute and
yeah,
start to actually
yeah,
listen.
yeah. It's an extraordinary thing. So, like most skills, some of us are better storytellers than others, but like we can learn to use Excel, we can learn the basic ideas about how to tell a story and how to use a story. And it just feels, I think people just feel it's fluffy, it's not
Mm.
hard. It's not hard business, and it's not hard numbers.
Right.
So I think that's where
And I think also people are afraid of that vulnerability, right? So
yeah.
let's talk about, like water is for fish. I have it right here. I started to read the book.
Snap.
Oh, great. I love it. I said, wow, like Garth is so vulnerable in this book. And I was like, all right, I've had a beer with you, you shared some of your emotional journey, and I felt really privileged to hear. Then I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh my, like you are really out there and talking about, the Jungle Doctor books and how they impacted you, and how actually you kind of started your career based on a story that ended up maybe failing you, but then ultimately maybe motivating you. And just the emotional journey you've been on. So how, Garth, did you find the courage to be so vulnerable? I mean, it's not easy.
Yeah.
And we know people don't do
Well,
it.
well, I suppose a lot of people have sort of asked me that, and it's sort of in a way surprised me, because it doesn't. I don't feel that vulnerable, to be honest. It doesn't feel. I suppose I've always been reasonably realistic about who I am,
Mm,
and
mm,
and I think I'm fortunate enough to have, in worldly terms, had some successes. And
right, right.
so being vulnerable for me does not undermine any of that. In fact, it helps people relate to that.
Mm,
So I
mm,
suppose if it might have been a lot more difficult if in worldly terms, I'm underlining worldly terms, I'd failed and was a failure,
mm, mm.
to then be vulnerable. But because, in worldly terms, I've been fortunate to have succeeded on I've failed in a lot of things, but I've succeeded in a bunch of things. I think it's easier for me to be vulnerable because there's no downside, you know.
Well, and that's real. I mean, it's really interesting because I think that there's so many people, again, if I think about my clients, that they're afraid to even say something as basic as I'm feeling tired. Like as
Yeah.
we're starting to see a return to the office and I'm starting to do in-person facilitations, I've been able to change the mood in the room by just encouraging the leader to say, it's been tough. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
tired. That's hardly a stripping bare of one's soul.
No.
And
No.
yet just an admission of, I am normally your pumped up, optimistic leader, but the reality is that I too am getting tired, allows people to say, yeah, it's been hard. It doesn't mean we're not going to keep going. It doesn't mean we lose faith in you, but we recognize that you're a fellow human. So even the most, the smallest morsel of self-sharing, I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think so. What you just said there, I think, is so key, and has been my experience, is that far from decreasing the respect that I have from my colleagues, it's increased it, and far from decreasing their respect for me as a leader and as somebody they can trust, it's increased it. And so, one of the breakthrough things that we did as an organization, which we then went and built, quite a large campaign around, is this concept of what's your story, is actually spending time each week and getting to know each other's stories a little bit better. And it's not everyone's whole story, but it's like forks in the road, etc. And the huge change based on, I thought you were a middle-aged white guy and you had it all together. I didn't realize you suffered from depression and anxiety, that you dipped out of multiple schools. I feel I can share more really where my struggles are,
Yeah.
and that you'll understand. So I think, did I do it consciously? The answer is no. So I don't sit down, read the book and say I must be more vulnerable. But intuitively, I think I realized that by being my real self was a lot more likely to just engender some degree of hey, we can do this together. And yeah.
But that's almost a theme that's emerging in this conversation, right? That there are certain ways in which you've just been true to yourself, what you call lazy, which others would term then as a deliberate leading from behind, what you just call very natural, is just sharing what's on your mind. But so there is a certain trueness to yourself that permeates the way in which you have operated. And by not editing out that self, you've actually been quite generative.
Yeah, again, I don't think it's a conscious choice. It's just to dissemble on that level doesn't feel comfortable. And I think one has to be clear is that there are times in which to be vulnerable and times not to be. If you, is that there are times to actually where people need you not to be vulnerable because they're feeling so vulnerable. But
Yes.
to understand that you've been there before. So yeah, I mean, right now is a hard time. It's globally. I mean, we South Africa continues to lurch from one crisis to another and has done ever since I've been alive. So navigating our way through this just as yet another thing. So at the same time, I take my responsibility to be strong for my team, while at the same time letting them know that I'm tired and
those exist simultaneously. And I think that we often underestimate ourselves and others by thinking that you have to have this or that emotion versus recognizing that what can seem like conflicting emotions can exist simultaneously and in the same person at the same time. So I can be motivated and excited for what we can do, and I can also be feeling kind of tired and somewhat depressed because of what we haven't been able to get accomplished to date. And that can be married, even though I think often people feel we have to choose one or the other.
Yeah, I think so. And look, I think it also depends on your work environment. I mean, I've been fortunate because you've asked the question before, so what gives me joy at work? And the answer is that the people I work with. I'm fortunate enough to work with people I respect and I really like, and we share a common values base. And so I suppose that in that environment where I'm not, afraid somebody's going to put a knife in my back, it's a lot easier to possibly, I don't know, I've never worked in a corporate sector,
Mm.
but I can't see that I would be any different in any other environment. And I think that the upsides of vulnerability, of being real, without being, I hoped, through my book, etc., it wasn't about a cry for help by any means. It
No.
was it's more a sense, I think Brené Brown has been so impactful because of
Mm.
this call to vulnerability, and it touches a chord with many people.
I think so. I mean, I saw your book as an invitation, right? An invitation to share your story, but also an invitation to listen to other people's stories. And I think that there's two sides of this, right? One is the telling of the story, and the other is, as you say, kind of activating our attention when someone says, I want to tell you a story. And then you say, I want to listen, right? And it's in that exchange that the meaning is made, that the joy is released. So I think that's really like both parts of that is so significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a little acronym for this called ALT, Ask, Listen, Tell. Be prepared to ask a little bit more of the stories of those that you interact with daily. So everything from, Melanie, where did your name come from?
Was it a chapter in the book about that?
The next book, actually at this point there won't be a next book, but everything from that to, hey Melanie, let's sit down and have coffee, and I don't want your CV, I want to know a little bit more. Tell me, where were you born? What was your family like?
Yeah.
Where did you grow up? That's next level. So that's ask, and then listen. This concept in Zulu, there is a word called sawubona. I greet you when I say so. It means I see you.
Mm-hmm.
The very process of asking a little bit more says I see you.
It's so true. And I there's so many expressions when I was in South Africa that I came away with that said this whole sense of interbeing, of understanding that I exist because of you, I
Yeah,
see you. There's a richness even in the language that communicates a way of being.
yeah,
Right?
yeah, and that greeting is such a great one because it says sawubona, I see you. But
Mm-hmm.
then equally, and as you get to L, ask, and then L, listen, is that you completely undermine all of that if you don't listen properly, because you're negating the other
Mm-hmm.
person's story. And in listening, we also need to be prepared to realize that you can't fix all the time. That listening is actually just listening is saying, I hear you,
Yeah.
and probably the skill we all need to learn most. I certainly do. And then tell, which is be prepared to share a little bit more, be vulnerable,
Mm.
get to know a little bit more of your own story. And as again, you as a psychologist would know that retracing and looking at your story and reframing it can
Yes.
be tremendously empowering, and things that felt like tragedies can actually be the seeds of something much better.
And in fact, I mean, therapy is often about rewriting your own narrative,
Yeah,
in being able to say, all right, well, how do I tell my story? And how do I tell my
yeah,
story in a way that is authentic and true, but is also going to give me energy and courage and confidence?
yeah, yeah,
It's interesting on the corporate level. I often find that people don't want to ask because they are afraid of what they will do with the information. And
yeah,
what I'll often say is, you don't have to solve, you just have to listen. And the
yeah,
act of listening is itself an action that has a tremendous impact. But too
yeah,
often people don't want to start the conversation because they're afraid of the responsibility that they will feel to
yeah,
provide a cure or a fix
yeah,
afterwards.
yeah,
Garth, do
yeah.
you have any? I mean, we're talking about some really tough, big issues here. Like, do you have a personal mantra or a thought or phrase or something that you are motivated by as you kind of push through all of these challenges?
Well, I think I mean, it sounds like a heavy one, but it's not at all. Which is to whom much is given, much is expected.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's something I try and teach my kids is that I have been blessed on numerous different levels, and
Right.
I feel a great degree of responsibility to use that gifting. Um, ultimately, I sort of believe that one day, we'll account for what we did with what we were given.
Yes.
Um, and so, yeah, I think that's very much so. it also gives me a reality check around me, in that things that I've achieved have often been as a result of great other people or circumstances, or, you know, a brain that I didn't ask for. I didn't, you know, ask to come up. None of these things. So to get too ego-driven and self-involved, when in fact a lot of what one achieves is just circumstantial and gifting. So that thing for me keeps me grounded, but also keeps me acknowledging, you know, life is short, and what you're going to leave a little bit of a mark on this planet.
And a sense of responsibility.
Yeah, but not in a heavy way. It's, you know, when we talk about privilege, absolutely I'm privileged. That's not the debate for me. You know, when people say, you know, we debate white privilege or any form of privilege, get over it. Of course we're privileged. So what are you going to do with it? That's the debate. Not so much whether you black privilege, white privilege, female privilege, South African privilege.
Right.
It's so what are you going to do with it? And own it and use it.
And not become overwhelmed by it. I mean, I think sometimes I find that people say, I want to lead a purpose-driven life, or because I have this privilege, I have responsibility, and now I'm paralyzed. And I think part of what you're describing is also the power of that individual interaction, such that I ask, I listen, I tell, we exchange, we deepen, and that in those moments, we build something quite magical.
Yeah. And acknowledging that we're not God. So, you know, is that, you know, I think sometimes we give ourselves too much responsibility, and the world is, you know, got some amazing, it's filled with amazing things and amazing people, and it's also got some horrible challenges. And we, you know, my responsibility is just simply to do that little bit in my corner. And I'm very taken with this, you know, I did a very, very awful TED talk, which was called "We Don't Build Cathedrals Anymore." And I said it was bad.
And why would you say that it's awful, other than your
my delivery, the concept was good, the delivery was poor. But the concept really is that cathedrals in Europe were built over 4 to 5 generations. Is that I would, you know, the person who built the foundations would never see the finished building, and that nor would the people who even finished it necessarily see the worshippers in 100 years' time. And so much of our society is built on what change have I made now, and can I measure it? And I use the example of, you know, so we don't build cathedrals anymore. And I use the example of the Jungle Doctor books, which, you know, influenced me. They were written in the 1950s. I wasn't even born then. So if you'd measured that guy's impact, Dr. Paul White, you know, and asked, you know, a year after his publication, so what difference has your books made? You'd have had to take me out of the equation, and all the work that I'd done, or been able to do. So it's also realistic about time, and around the fact that the swathes of history are not written in little 1 year, 3 year bursts. It's you know,
as you say, kind of planting the seeds of a tree whose shade you'll never sit under, right? Which I thought was a very poetic way of expressing it earlier on in our conversation. Our relationship with time is so instantaneous now.
We want metrics, we want measurables. You know, it's the same as what's driving corporate culture, this sort of quarterly reporting, which, you know, is taking away from the big picture of what is the impact. You know, business used to be for the social good, as well as for the bottom line. And hopefully we're seeing some shifts on that. But
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been all sorts of revolutions, but there's a revolution that hasn't quite happened, which is our relationship to time. Like it's almost happened to us and we haven't realized it. Garth, I have one other question I wanted to ask you, and then I wanted to make sure you could ask me any questions. But as I wrote a book about connection, I care so much about connection and people being able to foster them. I'm wondering what advice you have for people trying to salvage a broken connection? How do we reconnect? I mean, you have such a skill set and awareness about the importance of making that contact. What happens if it's been broken? What have you found in terms of ways to reconnect?
Sure, Melanie. As I say in the sort of game shows, next question, please. Pass. No, I think that it comes back down to this. I mean, probably the key thing is time. Is being prepared to invest time and energy in the relationship. Again, instantaneous world, we expect to get instant results, and if they don't happen, we move on. So if you do want to reestablish the connection in any way, it does require time, B, often forgiveness. Understanding what the barriers have been, and secondly, really listening to their story, because quite often your perception of what the problem is and where the problem lies are two different things.
Yes.
Again, through our experience of what's your story, people's perceptions. Oh, I thought because you looked like this was the problem, because you were a white man, etc. I now know your story. I'm just completely so investing time in asking and in listening, being prepared to ask for forgiveness or to forgive.
I think that's so. But I think that's so important, right? I mean, how do you reconnect after you've broken the connection? There's been a trust violation in some way, and that's painful, right? So rather than retreat, you have to actually go towards the conflict and have the conversation, right?
But I think also it depends, again, I'm very aware, I'm sure as you are, is that there are only X number of relationships that you can keep going. And those relationships that are precious to you, that have broken down, are the ones that require you to invest the energy and the understanding and the forgiveness and the listening, etc. But requires time, and is not instantaneous. And trust in particular takes, is not just a conversation. It's action over time, and being shown that, when I ask for forgiveness or I say I'm sorry, I then need to show that over time, not just in the moment.
It's funny, as you're saying that, I'm like writing down my equation, trust equals action over time, right? It's really so true. And I think that, in this day and age where people are collecting likes and followers, that it's this very instantaneous, somewhat superficial sense of relationships. Whereas tell me your story, listen to my story, let's share stories, let's make a story. Those are all repeated experiences that take time, that require being present, really showing up. And that we have moved to a place where it's so instantaneous and it's so technologically driven that we're often missing that. I want to keep to my promise of saying that I would save a couple minutes if there was anything you wanted to ask me or something that you'd like for us to chat about.
Melanie, lots to chat to you about, and I'd love to, do that over a cup of coffee when I come to New York hopefully in March. COVID, and that I managed to get through the border, etc. But no, I mean, I think, I think you and I have clearly resonated with each other, because I think we see a whole lot of things in common here. And I'm, I just loved reading your book.
Thank you.
I loved the use of story. I mean, essentially that's what you did, is that you just, and actually all the best books, that are trying to get across key principles. It's not an accident that all the best books that are trying to teach principles are using story, and you did that extensively and really, really well.
Thank you. I mean, that's wonderful to hear, and actually to the point that you made very early on about how did you build Soul City, you had to have a research team that had the numbers and the insights, then you had to match it with a story, and trying to connect first to be as impactful and readable. I thought, all right, I need to give people the science, here's the why, but then also here's the how, here's how it plays out. And I need to match the story with the science. And that's been, I think, a shared pursuit. I mean, I'm doing it at a much smaller level than you have, but I've been trying to say, the data is important. It triggers certain things for certain brains, but then what happens at the human level? And that's much more narrative.
Yeah, and as I say, that's what's memorable. Actually, I mean, we're just in the process of instituting something called 4X, which is 4 disciplines of execution. I mean, I hate these things, but it's about it's stuff that I know we need to do.
Oh,
It's which is around saying we need to be a bit more systematic, etc., around the work we do. But again, like great sort of business books, it's full of stories. And
mm,
one of the things that he talks about, and I remember it, and this is when I will introduce it to our team. He tells the story of a football game in the US where the scoreboard has been blown over by a hurricane, and he tells a story of how the crowd is completely disengaged from the game because they
mm.
can't see the score. And as a result, there's no clapping, there's no etc. They don't know who's which. I don't know American football, but which sector you're in or whatever, how many touchdowns there's been, and if you don't know the score, you can't play the game or get involved in
Wow.
the game. And so here's an example of using a story to illustrate a really important point, which is we need to keep score better, which is what we're going to try and do in our organization around the small wins, etc. But there was
Wow.
an example of a great story that sticks with me. And
Yes.
because I remember that story, I can transmit that principle to the people I work with.
So it's so fabulous. And actually, that's such a good story. Now I'll have to find the story in the book and then use that story, because hearing that, because I think the other thing about stories is you can pass them on.
Yeah, and I will change it slightly, and that's what the other thing about using story is that they don't have to be original stories. I will, I'll maybe just use an analogy that people here would be familiar with.
Yeah. And
So
actually, one of the exercises I do with some of the companies I work with is I have people tell stories, but over and over again. So we'll do like a lineup and you'll tell 3 people in a row your story. But lo and behold, same story gets modified as you say it over and over again. And then you listen to someone else's story and then you modify again.
yeah,
So actually that exchange helps us not only, I think, bed down the stories, but also kind of own them, modify them, kind of
yeah, yeah,
deepen
yeah.
them. I just want to kind of close off the formal portion of this by saying I could talk to you forever. It's so much fun. I realize there's tons to just chat about live and in person on my living room couch in our backyard, whichever way we can kind of get you here and entertain you. And so this has just been so much fun. And for my first conversation, I couldn't ask for a better conversational partner. I
Well,
really
thank
thank you.
you. I mean, it's been great, and it feels like it's been a long time, but it feels like it hasn't been so long actually. It feels like
Uh,
we've connected again quite quickly. So really
and I want you to know
grateful
there's a
for that.
lot of people who are very jealous because I couldn't help of showing off when I was in Scotland with the LQ team and saying, I am going to speak to Garth. And Jama was like, oh, he sent me a picture reading reading about Speed Dial 6. And then there was I think I may have mentioned this in an email, but also then there was Jason, who had been on the quest with us, who works in, I'm sorry, Justin Forsyth, worked in the UK government, was like, oh, Garth Japhet, he was really inspirational to me. And now that I'm working on this citizen connection to climate change, I'm trying to think about how you push out stories to change people's mindset. So you were like really alive and with us when we were all in Scotland at the TED Countdown. So I just want you to know that, as you say, you don't always know the impact that you have, but you really have such a big impact and have on the LQ community in such a strong way. So I come
Well,
to you
that's
with
really
lots of
kind.
regards,
Well,
everybody.
that's really kind. Thanks. And you can, when you see them all again, please just, yeah, I hope to see them in the flesh, not too long a time. So, Melanie, no, thank you. And yeah, I just love the work you do. So it's such a privilege to be part of it.
Thank you. So we'll send you the tape. You can,
Great.
feel free to use it as you'd like. And then as we start to figure out what we will actually do with the content, we'll certainly keep you posted about that too.
Fantastic. Thanks, Melanie.
Great.
Lots of
Take it
love.
easy.
Look forward to seeing you in the Big Apple.
I can't wait.
Okay.
Take care. Have a good
Okay.
weekend.
Pleasure, you
Bye-bye.
too. Thanks. Bye.